Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Thank you for coming out on this allegedly fall evening, although feels like late fall to me. My name is Adam Benson. I'm the Assistant Director of the Library and Archives at the York County History Center. Thank you for coming to join us at our Civil War Roundtable for this evening. If you can bear with me, I'd just like to discuss our usual upcoming events, and I will also be introducing next month's Civil War Roundtable program, and then I will introduce tonight's speaker. So first of all, as many of you know, and Linda Bean is with us tonight, next week on October 26th on Wednesday night at 7 p.m., we will be hosting the All Vets organization, and next week All Vets will be featuring Gary Lehman, who served in the Air Force Security Service in Germany and Taiwan from 1963 to 1969. On November 4th, this is the first Friday of November, at 6 o'clock, 6:30, 7, and 7:30 p.m. we will be having walking tours coordinated by various people with the History Center, some volunteers. And if you're interested in a walking tour of a little section of downtown York, please meet us at Beaver Street and West Clark Avenue. The reason I'm talking about that tonight is that the theme for November is the Civil War. So we'll learn a little bit about some Civil War related, Civil War relevant sites from the city of York. That's on the first Friday, November 4th. On Sunday, November 6th, between 2:30 and 4 p.m., the South Central Pennsylvania Genealogical Society will be meeting here in this room at the Historical Society Museum. And the Vice President of the South Central Organization and attorney, Richard K. Conkle, will be presenting Revisiting Online Research of German Ancestors. And I can attest from being here on Saturdays when Richard visits us that he is always doing research on his own German ancestors. His ancestors were relatively recent immigrants to the United States. And so he's pretty well versed in tracing these very often difficult sources in order to link people up with German immigrants. All right, and then the next major event that we'll be hosting is on Saturday, November 12th, which some of you might know significantly is Articles of Confederation Day. And obviously the Articles of Confederation were passed, the resolution was passed by the Continental Congress during their stay in York in 1777. So on November 12th, the History Center will be recognizing that important day. We've got loads of events scheduled. It'd probably take me half an hour to read them all, but they are all listed on the website. Some of them include a 10:30 presentation by living historian Daniel Cross, who will be portraying young George Washington. We also have multiple reenactments during the day, a play about the formation of the Articles of Confederation done by local people, a presentation on Ben Franklin and the Articles of Confederation, and multiple other things that might be of interest. So please check our website. Unsurprisingly, all of that's taking place at the Colonial Complex on November 12th. So I'd like to move on to talking about some roundtable events. Kathy has asked me to discuss the very important and significant fact that tonight marks the 15th anniversary of the partnership that the History Center has had with the York Civil War Roundtable. So the Roundtable has been meeting here since October of 2007. So that's pretty amazing. I'm glad that we've been able to cement that partnership and keep it going over a lot of different times over the last 15 years. And in addition to that, the Roundtable originally formed as the White Rose CWRT in 1997. So it's also celebrating its 25th anniversary this year. So 1997 does not seem like 25 years ago, but it is. So 25 years for the organization and 15 in their partnership with us. And we hope that that will continue for many years to come. So thank you for being here. The Roundtable would like to thank the History Center for our support. We appreciate this relationship. And also, we'd like to thank Roundtable members for their many years of continued support and dedication to preserving the Civil War history of York County. So thank you for coming out. All right, and before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to talk about next month's speaker. That's November 16th, the third Wednesday evening. Lincoln Comes to Gettysburg, the story of the creation of the Soldiers National Cemetery. And our speakers will be Dr. Bradley Gottfried and his wife, Linda Gottfried. If you remember back in ancient times when we were online, I'm not quite sure, was that this year or last year? It was this past January, really? Wow. It seems like a long time ago. I'm not sure why. But anyway, Dr. Gottfried will be returning in person to the History Center this time and presenting on the following. Most visitors to the National Cemetery at Gettysburg are unaware of its difficult birth. Many steps were required to bring the idea to fruition, from the decision to form the cemetery to its dedication. This presentation will highlight the single-minded activities of several men who made it happen, from Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin, who championed the idea, to William Saunders, who created the cemetery's plan, to Ward Layman, who planned the consecration ceremony, to Basil Briggs, who helped dig up all the corpses so they could be moved to the National Cemetery. They all toiled to bring the cemetery to fruition, but one person towers above all the others, David Wills, who played a major role during each phase. Abraham Lincoln also played a major role, and his story is one of sadness, fortitude, and mystery. The story of his visit is the stuff of legends. So Brad and Linda Gottfried will be doing a PowerPoint presentation to illustrate the cemetery's formation and Lincoln's visit. So please join us next month, November 16th, 7 p.m. for the Gottfrieds. All right, last but not least, I'll be introducing Codie Eash, who is a graduate of Shippensburg University and serves as Director of Education and Museum Operations at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center in Gettysburg. In addition to museum tours and interpretation, he lectures for national park sites, historical societies, Civil War roundtables, educational groups, and other organizations. He has published articles and essays in local newspapers, regional magazines, and national history journals. He is a founding contributor to the collaborative project Pennsylvania in the Civil War, writes book reviews for Civil War Monitor, and maintains the Facebook blog Codie Eash, Writer and Historian, which primarily focuses on the Civil War era. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Codie.
Well, thank you very much, Adam, for the introduction, and thank you all very much for being here, for those who are joining us online. This evening, we're going to be talking about the Lutheran Seminary in the Battle of Gettysburg, which is now home to Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center. The last time that I was here, I talked about Pennsylvania Day, the dedication of Pennsylvania monuments all across the Gettysburg battlefield in 1889. We're going to take a step back even further than that this time to the origins of the Lutheran Seminary and, of course, the Battle of Gettysburg, but also touch upon those memory aspects and legacy aspects, because as we'll see, the seminary grounds, and the seminary building all have interesting roles to play in that legacy of the Gettysburg battlefield itself. But for starters, we're going to just talk a bit about the museum itself. Now, I know I see a couple of familiar faces here. How many of you, by raise of hands, have been to Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center? About half of the audience here. Thank you very much for visiting. For those who have not, I'm just going to go for a few minutes through what we have to offer. In case I do forget to mention it, off to your right side on the table at the front there, we do have some information available, membership opportunities, information on upcoming events. I'll talk about one of those events coming up in just a little while, which Brad Gottfried is going to be participating in just a couple of weeks before he's going to speak here. But we do have a lot of exciting things happening at Seminary Ridge. As I mentioned, membership opportunities, and there's a sign-up sheet for a mailing list there if you'd like to receive email notifications about those events. But just to kind of briefly go through who we are, what we have to offer, the stories that we tell. We like to say that Seminary Ridge is where you can see where it all began. And that's meant to be a generally vague statement. The it there can be interpreted in multiple different facets. On the one hand, we can look at the it that begins there is really the story of how we memorialize the Gettysburg battlefield. The building itself, as we will see, is constructed in 1832. So by the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, it's a 31-year-old structure. And in 1914, there's a structure that's dedicated on the western face of the building, the Peace Portico, the first monument ever dedicated to peace on the Gettysburg battlefield. And at the dedication of that memorial, the keynote oration is delivered by the Reverend Dr. Henry Eyster Jacobs, who maybe is a famous name to some of you. His father, Michael, had been a professor of mathematics and chemistry at Pennsylvania College during the battle, what we know today as Gettysburg College. He's perhaps best known as Gettysburg weatherman. He wrote one of the earliest books on the battle, maybe the earliest book on the battle, published in the fall of 1863. Well, his son, Henry Eyster, was at the time of the battle a recent graduate of Pennsylvania College and a soon-to-be student at the Lutheran Seminary. And by the time we reach 1914, 51 years after the battle, he is the president of the Philadelphia Lutheran Seminary. And when he returns, he talks about this building and encapsulates it in better terms than perhaps anybody ever has. He says in part that this old building is more truly a monument of the battle than are the hundreds of costly structures scattered over this historic field. He's talking about what we know today in 2022 as the 1,300 monuments, memorials, markers that scatter the Gettysburg battlefield. But he says this building is more truly a monument than any of those post-war structures. And why, he says, because they were not here when the air was full of shrieking shells and stifling vapors, but it was then that these walls received their baptism of fire. This building was itself a part of the battle. And today, in a building that looks much the same as it did in 1863, we can see some of those stories that played out when these walls received that baptism of fire, as Jacob said. Our museum covers the early history of the seminary, the religious and racial components that come with a religious institution being right on the Mason-Dixon line, just 8 miles north of that line between slavery and freedom. The complexities that come along with that in the town of Gettysburg, but also in this building and on this campus. Scenes that play out in paintings that are featured throughout the museum, such as the one you see here, 10 original pieces of art by renowned military history artist Dale Gallant. And here depicting the scene from 1835, just 3 years after this building was constructed. And the Reverend Dr. Samuel Schmucker, founder of the seminary, is welcoming to the institution the eventual Reverend Dr. Daniel Alexander Payne, the first Black student at the Gettysburg Seminary, one of the first African Americans ever admitted to a postgraduate institution in the United States. And so we tell those stories of these causes, consequences that are coming about in the years leading up to the Civil War itself. Of course, the it that began here can also be seen as the battle itself. It begins about 2 miles west of the seminary, but so many of the consequential decisions that are made on July 1st, 1863, and of course, a great deal of what plays out that first day of battle take place on the grounds and in some cases on or in the building itself. And so the it that begins here, we talk about in that regard. We also can look at the it begins here as being the birth of battlefield medicine at Gettysburg. The first major military hospital on the battlefield is in the Lutheran Seminary building, a hospital that would continue its usage for 2.5 months, serving approximately 700 soldiers of both the United States and Confederate armies, one of the largest and longest serving hospitals on the Gettysburg battlefield. And we also have educational programming that ties together many of these themes. Educational programming focusing upon medical practices of the Civil War era. We do Become a Soldier programs focusing on individual soldiers who were on Seminary Ridge July 1st, 1863, and other programs focusing upon the 19th century. So if you are an educator, know an educator, by all means, pick up one of my cards, have them reach out to me. We do have group programming available, especially for schools. So let's take a step back and dive into the meat of our subject for the evening. Let's go back even further than 1863, even further than 1832. We're going to go back to 1826. The United States at this point in time is 50 years separated from having declared its independence. And what we're starting to see in South Central Pennsylvania is the birth of German Lutheranism spreading. Now, up to this point in time, there's one Lutheran seminary in the United States, and it's in Hartwick, New York, near Cooperstown. The upstate part of New York, not easily accessible, especially for students living south of the Mason-Dixon line. And so Samuel Simon Schmucker, born in 1799, is in his mid-20s. He's a Lutheran pastor at that point in time, serving 5 church congregations in the Shenandoah Valley, Virginia, and the outskirts of Newmarket, which coincidentally would, of course, be a Civil War battlefield in 1864. And Schmucker had spent a good deal of his the early days of his life as a native of Hagerstown, Maryland, but also as a resident here in York. And Schmucker is going to be commissioned by the General Synod of the Lutheran Church for finding a better location for a seminary than in upstate New York, somewhere that might be more easily accessible for those living both north and south of the Mason-Dixon line. And he basically looks at 3 towns. One is his hometown of Hagerstown, Maryland. Secondly, he looks at Carlisle, Pennsylvania, specifically on the campus of Dickinson College. But thirdly, he looks at Gettysburg. And in Gettysburg, we can see this black dot here on this Adams County map from 1858, a map, by the way, that is utilized by officers during the Gettysburg campaign, all the way from Jubal Early in the days before he arrives here at York on the Confederate side, to Oliver Otis Howard, the 11th Corps commander for the Army of the Potomac. Both sides will utilize this map. And on this map, we can see why Gettysburg might be an appealing location for an institution of higher learning. With 10 roads creating this crossroads hub situated just north of the Mason-Dixon line, Gettysburg is going to be that crossroads hub that brings about not just the Lutheran Seminary in 1826, but also Pennsylvania College or Gettysburg College in 1832. It brings Underground Railroad activity through the region, as well as that reverse Underground Railroad, if you will, that darker piece of the Underground Railroad story of slave catchers, especially after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And it will, of course, be these many roads that bring these 2 massive armies, 160,000 combined soldiers, to the town in the summer of 1863. And so Schmucker decides on Gettysburg in 1826 as the place to put the seminary. Now, before that major seminary building is constructed in 1832, for the first 6 years of its operation, the seminary is going to operate at the building you see on your right-hand side here. And that is the Adams County Academy building. The structure still stands today. You go to the southeast corner of the intersection at Washington and High Streets. The building is still standing. And for the first 6 years of the seminary's operation, that is where the students would have resided and had their classes. Samuel Schmucker, though, within those 6 years, realizes he has 2 problems on his hand. Number one, many of the students who are coming to this institution, where you earn a master's of divinity, don't so much as have a bachelor's degree or really any post-secondary education. So he needs some place to become a proving ground, to become a undergraduate liberal arts institution. And that's how he is going to come up with the idea for what we now know as Gettysburg College. The other issue that he has on his hands is that that building is not large enough. As a dozen students turns to 24 students, and it will continue to grow from there. And so in 1830, there's going to be ground broken. In 1832, the major seminary structure is completed. It has 4 major floors, which include the dorm rooms, the classrooms, the student assembly area, the library, chapel, dining hall, kitchen, and living quarters for the caretakers. The entire Lutheran Seminary campus, anyone coming to Gettysburg to study theology, to become a Lutheran minister, everything they need is right there in that central structure. Followed 2 years later, there are going to be an additional 2 structures completed. One is the home of Schmucker himself. It's where my office is today on the southern end of the seminary campus. That's completed in 1833. And on the northern side of the campus in 1834, a home for the Reverend Dr. Charles Kraut. So he would not reside there until 1850 when he becomes a professor here at the seminary. But he is the first president of Pennsylvania College as well before his time at the Lutheran Seminary. Now, of course, the most famous piece of the seminary building, and we'll talk about its role in the context of the battle, is the cupola that sits atop the structure, primarily built for the sake of ventilation, more so than observation, but also perhaps built as a bell tower. And this is another place that we can insert York into this story. Just after the seminary building is constructed, the seminary board is going to have in its records a thank you note sent to a Lutheran church in York for the use of its bell. They have received a bell as a gift. This bell, though, does not have ever appeared to have been placed in the cupola of the seminary. We don't exactly know what happened to that bell. But 25 years after the battle, in the late 1880s, In Frank Leslie's magazine, there's an article called Lager Beer in America. And in this article about lager beer, there's the story of this bell, which was called the beer lager bell. And apparently this bell had originated in a church in New York City. That church had two bells, donated one of them to a new Lutheran church in the 18th century in what is now Lower Windsor Township, York County. And ultimately that bell is what was donated to the church in York. Now, the reason it's called the lager bell is the fact that in the 18th century, this article explains, when a church bell was christened, when it was brought to a church for the first time, it will be turned upside down. Lager beer would be poured into it, and the pastor would bless this bell, and the people of the congregation and the local community, they would dip their pint into it and take a drink. And ultimately became known as the lager bell, but also as the children's bell. It would apparently toll whenever a child died in the local community. And so Schmucker reportedly would have lived his early life when he was living here in York under the sound of that bell. And that bell is donated to the seminary, but there's no record that it ever actually was in the cupola at the time of the battle or any other period for that matter. So it is a bit of a mystery with a York connection. Now, this is what the inside of the seminary building looks like today. What we're seeing now, though, is not quite what it would have looked like originally, but rather what it looked like as of 1895, 32 years after the battle, the most significant renovation of the building's history. Most of the paneling and wainscoting on the walls, most of the flooring, the stairwells, there's one here at that end, there's one also behind the camera, and then most of the interior room designs, most of that is from 1895, not necessarily what you would have seen if you were there in 1863. But the one exception to that is that in the attic of the building, we do still have a lot of original features, including the eastern floorboards, the entire base of the cupola, which is what you're looking kind of up the center of here, is original up to about the roof of the building. From the roof up, the cupola burned as a result of a lightning strike in August of 1913, just after the 50th anniversary of the battle. And so unfortunately, not the entire cupola is original, but the base of it is. Most of the ceiling up here in the attic is original. You can't quite see any of the brick walls, but a lot of the brick walls are original. The stairs have been rebuilt a few times, including most recently in 2012. But when you do visit Seminary Ridge Museum, we do have a ticket option that enables you to get up into the cupola and get that view that you would have had, that John Buford would have had on July 1st, 1863. So let's take a look then at how the seminary fits into the confines of the Gettysburg campaign and, of course, the battle itself. One of my favorite period maps to use here, not necessarily because it's the most accurate. There are a couple of towns that are a little bit out of place. Emmitsburg is actually southeast of Fairfield, for instance, a couple of other errors that are there. But this is one of the earliest maps that people around the United States would have seen as they were becoming familiar with what happened at Gettysburg in 1863. This is published in Harper's Weekly on July 18th, 1863. So just 2 weeks or so after the battle. And it's an excellent way that we can look not only at topography, we can see the South Mountain Range off to the west here, of course, that northern extension of the Blue Ridge Mountains of central Virginia. We can trace also here essentially the route that Robert E. Lee's army would have taken, making their way up, rather down the valley, the western side of the valley, coming through the mountain, particularly at the gap around Cashtown, which we can see, there's Cashtown. We can see the Cumberland Valley here, coming through the gap at Cashtown. We can see the fact that Lee's army, its approaches to Gettysburg with about a third of his army, Richard Ewell's corps near Carlisle and just south of Harrisburg. Of course, one division of Ewell's corps made its way through Cashtown and Gettysburg all the way out to York and eventually to Wrightsville at the Wrightsville-Columbia Bridge. And we can also look at the fact that about 2/3 of Lee's army, A.P. Hill's corps and James Longstreet's corps, concentrated around Cashtown. And Lee, of course, established his own headquarters at Chambersburg. So it's an all-encompassing map, and this is a map that, or this is a section of that map, but I encourage you, the fully digitized editions of Harper's Weekly, you can go online and look at this entire regional map. When we consider what people were experiencing when they were first looking at this map, July 18th, Gettysburg has just happened, Fort Wagner is happening that day in South Carolina, and the New York City draft riots are beginning. So a consequential time at which someone would have been originally looking at this map. Now, of course, more locally, as Lee's army is making its way through South Central Pennsylvania, by the end of June, Lee is looking for an opportunity to pull his Confederate army back to one central location. And as we touched upon in that earlier glimpse of that 1858 map, here's a zoomed in section of it. Gettysburg is where all of those roads meet. And so Lee with his army to the west, to the north, to the northeast of Gettysburg, the one common thread that connects those disjointed pieces in south central Pennsylvania is going to be Gettysburg. But coincidentally, the United States Army of the Potomac, newly under the command of Major General George Gordon Meade, is likewise sending cavalry to scout out this general area to find the nearest place that they might be able to locate a portion of Lee's army. And so at about 11 o'clock in the morning of June 30th, 1863, these lines will start to converge. The blue line here indicating the two brigades in the division of Brigadier General John Buford and his cavalry that arrived from the south, and the gray arrow here indicating the brigade of about 2,000 North Carolinians, Confederate soldiers commanded by James Johnston Pettigrew. The Lutheran Seminary marked here by the museum logo with the cupola on it. Well, standing at that cupola, at that seminary, at about the time these two sides are beginning to converge, is a man we mentioned a bit ago, Henry Eyster Jacobs, who would return in 1914 to deliver that speech at the dedication of the Peace Portico. At this point in time, he's just 18 years old. He's not yet a student at the seminary, but he says he's standing in the cupola with his father's telescope. And as he looks out to the west, he notices on the side of South Mountain, campfires burning, dust being kicked up. But as he looks a little bit nearer along the Chambersburg Pike, Route 30, west of Gettysburg today, he sees a line of Confederate gray. And as he looks to the south, he sees a line of Union blue on horseback. And he says that for a brief moment, it felt like the Civil War was about to meet at his feet. As he would write in his memoir, it was clear to me the critical hour was at hand. Well, General Buford is going to make his way through Gettysburg. Confederate forces back off. They've been given the order to avoid an engagement at that point in time. And Buford is going to get to work on observing the area, recognizing that because you have these roads leading west, north, and northeast of Gettysburg, this is a good place to perhaps make a demonstration, hold off the Confederate advances. And when we consider what Buford knew in that moment, 8 miles southwest of Gettysburg on the Fairfield-Hagerstown Road, Buford's men had actually engaged in a brief skirmish against a couple of Confederate regiments. So Buford knows for a fact there are rebel forces there. He has now physically seen North Carolina soldiers on the Chambersburg Pike. There are rebel forces there. And one of his men has picked up a note dropped along the Harrisburg Road northeast of town, indicating that Jubal Early's men are marching through the town of Berlin, a reference to East Berlin. So Buford knows there are rebel forces there. What Buford decides to do is send out his signal officer, First Lieutenant Aaron Jerome, pictured here at the Elk Mountain Signal Station the fall before Gettysburg in October 1862, 160 years ago this month, just after the Battle of Antietam. Jerome is an interesting figure in his own right, overlooked in the grand scheme of things. Alabama born, he's 24 years old in the summer of 1863. He had been orphaned before the age of 12. He grew up just west of New York City, in northern New Jersey. He enlisted in the 1st New Jersey Volunteers. He's one of the first 1,000 men from the Garden State to enlist in the United States Army in 1861. And by the summer of 1862, he establishes himself not just as a good infantryman, but as a particularly skilled officer on the battlefield for the use of his eyes and the use of spyglasses. And that's going to earn him a transition and a promotion to the United States Signal Corps, which is in its own right a brand new piece of the Federal Army. Well, by the summer of 1863, he's on the staff of General Buford, serving as Buford's divisional signal officer. Buford tells Jerome after arriving at Gettysburg, June 30th, 1863, seek out the most prominent points and watch everything. That's the tall order that Buford gives to Jerome that evening. Now, Jerome is, as I mentioned, a figure who we can see has an interesting story. There's not a whole lot known about him, but one of the fascinating connections that he has is that he's in a couple of these really indicative Signal Corps photos. This is another one from that same time frame as that first one we looked at. And one of the interesting things we can see here is the Signal Corps perhaps working as liberators in a sense. We can see 3 young Black men, one in the center, one on each of the sides here, including one who is sort of clinging to Lieutenant Jerome, perhaps a servant, perhaps someone who was recently freed by the movements of the Signal Corps during the Maryland campaign. Of course, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation filed literally a couple of weeks before this photograph would have been taken. What we can see in this image, and this is Jerome here at the center, the spyglass, we can see the signal Corps hat that he was wearing in that previous image. We can see a couple of the signal flags. Really interesting photos that he is part of here that Alexander Gardner captured in the fall of 1862. And now back to Gettysburg. Jerome is tasked with seeking out those prominent points, watching everything. So what does he actually see? For those who have been to the cupola, you know the photos don't quite do the view justice, but I'll give you just some sense of what you can see from there versus what you would have seen from that cupola at the time of the battle. So the top images in these next few slides, they are owned by the Adams County Historical Society. They were taken originally by William Tipton in 1885, famous Gettysburg photographer, just 22 years after the battle. And so there is 2 decades of tree growth, but generally speaking, this is a pretty good idea of what you would have seen. Our western view is the most unchanged of the views. Now the mountain range is cut off, and even in a full version of this photo, it's relatively obscured in the background. We can see how picturesque, how noticeable that South Mountain range is. And that's where Lieutenant Jerome and others are going to notice campfires and dust and the movements of the Confederate Army just to the west. A little nearer, this large grove of trees is what we today know as Reynolds Woods. At the time of the battle, McPherson Woods, or properly known as Herbst Woods. And that would all be along the crest of McPherson Ridge, about 800 yards west of the seminary. The western view, though, is different from 1863 in one major regard, and it's a unique one. And it's that there were more trees during the battle than there are today. Usually it's the opposite story when we visit a Civil War battlefield. We talk about how clear things were at the time compared to now, but here we have a position that is quite contrary to that. And we can see that by this 1885 photo. Looking off to the northeast, another position that has about a third of the Confederate Army that Jerome is going to be heavily concerned with. What was then known as the Gettysburg Plains, this large, open, flat expanse of ground, today filled in by the more modern structures at Gettysburg College. We can still get a general sense. Our lines of sight are unchanged. Buildings haven't really grown upward in Gettysburg, even though things have grown outward. When you're standing in that cupola, you can still get an appreciation and see those distant roads that he would have been looking at. Up to the east, we can see the growth of the town of Gettysburg itself, a population of about 2,400 residents in 1863, just shy of 8,000 today. It's a little more than tripled its size since 1863. And likewise, only 3 original structures over at Pennsylvania College, and again, the outgrowth of Gettysburg College and its numerous structures today. And then finally, looking off to the southeast and south, this is a view that unfortunately is quite obscure compared to 1863. In the 1950s, a lot of vegetation really started to grow up. We can't quite get the same appreciation you would have had during the battle. And unfortunately, the 1885 photos, they're really kind of washed out in the background. But in a more modern sense, we can see Wolf Hill, we can see Culp's Hill, we can see that light blue water tower there at Cemetery Hill, which continues to the right, and then we have the start of Cemetery Ridge. But at the time of the battle, fewer buildings, fewer trees. Even with the naked eye, you would have been able to see pretty far to the south. And actually, we're looking down, you can very faintly see this, but that's Little Round Top, and that's Big Round Top. On a clear winter day, now in 2022, when there are no leaves on the trees and it's no humidity, of course, we can see a good portion of Big Round Top. So Buford, now that he has his signal officer placed in the cupola of the seminary at the ground level, is going to place his roughly 2,700 horse soldiers, his dismounted cavalry troopers, under 2 brigades, one commanded by Colonel William Gamble, the other by Colonel Thomas Devon. Buford's line ultimately looks like a large upside-down U, stretching from its left flank, the Fairfield Road, across the Chambersburg Pike, across the Mumsburg Road, across the Harrisburg Road and Carlisle Road, got those backwards, Carlisle Road and Harrisburg Road, and the right flank resting over toward the York Pike, Route 30 east of town today. It's about 5 miles from end to end, roughly 30 yards between individual soldiers and many points across this line. Buford himself establishes his headquarters at the southwest edge of Gettysburg, along Chambersburg Street and Washington Street at the Eagle Hotel, today the site of the 7-Eleven. Others will be in the cupola. I mentioned Aaron Jerome, which is him here, post-war photo at the bottom left there. He mentions that General Buford was in the cupola. One of the great sagas, of course, of the first day of the battle is Buford's use of the cupola. We'll talk more about that momentarily, but Jerome hints at the fact that Buford gets a view for himself that evening of June 30th. Thomas Devon is placed in the cupola by an account written by this man, Major Jerome Wheeler of the 6th New York Cavalry. Jerome Wheeler talks about the fact that he overhears this brief dispute of sorts that takes place between Buford and Devon, and Aaron Jerome writes about this as well. It makes its way, in a sense, into the movie Gettysburg. There's a kind of an adapted, fictionalized version of this account there. But essentially what happens, according to these two officers, is Tom Devon tells Buford that he thinks it'll be a relatively easy fight the next morning. Buford says, no, the enemy will come booming, skirmishers 3 deep. We'll have to fight like the devil to hold this ground until supports arrive. According to Jerome Wheeler's recollection, that confrontation occurred in the cupola at the Lutheran Seminary. And then also some civilians will be there. We already mentioned Henry Eyster Jacobs, that soon-to-be seminarian who actually noticed the armies as they were starting to concentrate at Gettysburg. And this young lady is 13 years old at the time of the battle. Lydia Ziegler, the daughter of the caretakers of the Lutheran Seminary. She's up in the cupola the night of June 30th, and several decades later, she said, I could vividly recall all of the campfires burning along the side of the Blue Mountain, as she explains it. It still has a blue tint that we can see today when we go there. She mentioned seeing those Confederate campfires, wondering what those young men might be thinking, and then she looks down below the cupola, and encamped on the grounds of the Lutheran Seminary, the Union soldiers of Colonel William Gamble's brigade, she hears them singing and praying and sees them writing letters home, and she wonders for how many of these men this will be their last night on earth. So she has a particularly poignant thing that she is observing from the cupola in the midst of all these military men who are making their tactical and strategic arrangements. Now enter early morning, July 1st, 1863. About 5 o'clock in the morning, Henry Heath's roughly 8,000 or so Confederate infantrymen begin marching out of the confines of Cashtown, about 8-9 miles west of Gettysburg. By 7:30, they're coming closer to Gettysburg, and they'll get as far west as Knoxland Ridge before one of Buford's men sees them, opens fire, and famously this ignites the Battle of Gettysburg. I mentioned earlier, throughout our museum, Seminary Ridge Museum, we have a series of 10 paintings commissioned by Dale Gowan. This is one of them called Buford's Boys, depicting the fighting that is taking place out on top of McPherson Ridge. We can see the line of Buford skirmishers here. Actually, we're back here just off the map. This would be her ridge, just west of McPherson Ridge. This is a section of a map that we have featured in our museum as well, a series of maps that go in depth into what happened on July 1st in a rather clear manner. But the fighting will take place from about 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. out on McPherson Ridge. Buford's men outnumbered approximately 4-1. We can see the seminary is visible in the background. We know from some accounts from the cupola that there are about a half a dozen seminary students who can actually see what's happening out to the west. One of them, Martin Luther Kohler, says that we could see the first puffs of smoke from the mouths of booming cannon. And he says that they're up there for a time until eventually, as that fighting comes ever closer, Confederate artillery is now firing what he describes as well-aimed shots toward the Union signal officer in the tower, and that was enough to let us know to get to a safer space. And so the students and the faculty of the seminary are, by and large, by late morning, early afternoon, starting to flee from the seminary back half a mile or so into the town. Now, John Buford and John Reynolds, this famous meeting that takes place on the morning of July 1st, 1863. Reynolds, of course, at this point in time is most famous for being First Corps commander, but specifically he's the left wing commander. He has the 1st, the 3rd, and the 11th Infantry Corps under his command, as well as Buford's division of cavalry. Buford has been in Gettysburg for the better part of 24 hours by the time that John Reynolds arrives to relieve him and provide some infantry support. And one of the great controversies of July 1st is where exactly the first meeting was between these two officers. Well, there are multiple individuals who write something about this, and of course, each says something a little bit differently than the others. Aaron Jerome, Buford's signal officer, his is the most famous iteration of events. It's what eventually plays out on the big screen in the movie Gettysburg in 1993. He essentially says in a pair of accounts written in 1865 and 1867, that as that fighting is happening out to the west of Gettysburg, Buford's men are being overrun at her and eventually McPherson Ridges. And that as he looks to the south, he notices that coming up the Emmitsburg Road, he can see from the cupola 2 miles away, giving us a sense of how open that view once was, the arriving First Corps of General Reynolds. He sends us an aide out to get General Buford. Buford comes back to the seminary, makes his way up into the cupola, and he's apparently there when Reynolds arrives. And that's the meeting that takes place, according to Jerome. By his recollection, the dialogue is the famous series of lines. "What's the matter, John?" asks Reynolds, to which Buford responds, "The devil's to pay." And Reynolds says, "Can you hold?" Buford says, "I reckon I can." And Reynolds says, "Let's go and see." That is how Aaron Jerome remembered this happening, and it makes its way into another of the Dale Gowan paintings of the meeting that takes place between these two officers just in front of the seminary building. But notably, all of Reynolds's aides, of whom there are at least 4 or 5 who wrote in-depth accounts of what they remembered happening July 1st, none of them initially mentioned the seminary as the first meeting place. Rather, they mention out at the McPherson farm, which would be basically in the center of the Union line here. Here's a Lutheran seminary for some reference. Others would change their stories so that as they revisited the battlefield in the decades that followed, they would say, "Yeah, I thought that this meeting happened out at the farm of Edward McPherson. I remember it being farm buildings, but now that I've revisited the battlefield, this seminary building, this appears to be the place that I remember them first conversing." And there's even one account from Peter Culp, who is a Gettysburg resident. He says they met at Buford's headquarters at the Eagle Hotel, which is about, I don't know, half a mile or so away from the seminary or McPherson Ridge, maybe a mile from McPherson Ridge. And so it's a reminder of the fact that even as we start to try to corroborate sources, we have at least 7 eyewitnesses who all witnessed the exact same event and all witnessed it almost exclusively different from the other people around them. We have to try to weave together those stories, but the Lutheran Seminary is situated right at the center of the possible meeting locations of these two officers. Of course, not long after General Buford and General Reynolds meet, Reynolds will go back down to the Emmitsburg Road, the fields of what become Pickett's Charge 2 days later, and he starts to bring up the 1st Division of the 1st Union Corps. And these men are going to make their way past the Lutheran Seminary. We're going to see some famous units. The Brigade of Lysander Cutler, men from New York and Pennsylvania, will move north and just south of the Chambersburg Pike. They'll be hovering around locations like the railroad cut and the McPherson farm. 4 of the 5 regiments of the famous Iron Brigade, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Indiana men will make their way right across to McPherson Ridge and enter Herbst Woods. And there at the head of those men, General Reynolds is killed, highest ranking officer to fall in the 3 days of Gettysburg. One regiment, the 6th Wisconsin, is going to be positioned back on the grounds of the seminary. They're being held in reserve. And as they're being held at that location, Dr. George New, surgeon of the 7th Indiana and surgeon-in-chief of this division, he looks at the Lutheran Seminary building and he determines that it will be the first major military hospital anywhere in the Gettysburg battlefield. By day's end, thanks to Dr. New's work, at least 300 wounded Union soldiers are being treated in the walls of the seminary building. As all that is happening, the fighting continues just to the west of the seminary. Mass casualties taking place out on McPherson Ridge. And General Abner Doubleday, who was taken command of the field momentarily after Reynolds was killed, he determines that just in case that McPherson Ridge line doesn't hold, the last hope that you have for holding on to the ridges west of Gettysburg is by establishing a barricade at the grounds of the Lutheran Seminary. He calls it a precautionary measure in his official report. On the back wall, the back side of the seminary, today there's a large peace portico, as I mentioned, dedicated in 1914. It's not there during the battle, but this is the earliest known photos of the back side of the building. But in this general area, men of the 16th Maine Infantry at about 12 o'clock noon, they're going to build a large semicircular barricade of rails, tearing down fence rails, digging up stumps, taking down portions of trees, and they're going to build all this up to about knee high. This precautionary measure is there so that Union soldiers have something to defend themselves in the event Confederate forces break through that initial position. As these men are building that barricade, suddenly, Lieutenant Jerome, in the cupola still, is going to alert General Oliver Howard back here in Cemetery Hill. He can see what he describes as a mile-long line of rebels advancing on our right, and there is nothing but cavalry to oppose them. That cavalry starts to pull back, leaving this large open area on the Union right flank. And so the men building the barricade at the seminary, they're shuffled off a mile north to Oak Ridge. And General Howard's reinforcements, as they continue to arrive throughout the afternoon, 2/3 of them, about 6,000 men, are placed north of Gettysburg in those so-called Gettysburg Plains, those open, flat expanses of ground north of Pennsylvania College that are not particularly good for defense. By the time we get to about 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the Union line takes on this shape, generally of an inverted V, an upside down L. You kind of pick your shape there. It has multiple portions of the line, these salients that are facing both west and north. Add to that a numerical disadvantage, a significant one. By about 4 in the afternoon, roughly 16,000 Union soldiers on the field, altogether about 30,000 Confederates from 4 separate rebel divisions moving in from the west and north of town. And they will eventually drive back federal forces from those fields north of the college. The 11th Corps will lose its footing, retreating back through Gettysburg, where severe street fighting is going to take place. And on the western side of town, before the Union retreat back through Gettysburg itself, there is a temporary halt at the Seminary. Another Dale Gallen painting here called Withdrawal of the 151st Pennsylvania, a descendant of the 151st Pennsylvania in the room here. It was killed on July 1st. This position defended by these men for the better part of an hour. And here you can see that rail barricade depicted. 2 times in the course of about an hour, hour and a half, this regiment, one of the largest in either army at Gettysburg, nearly 500 men, finds itself at the center of Confederate attacks from 3 separate sides. And it's going to result in them losing about 75% of their strength July 1st, entering battle with 475 soldiers, retreating back to Cemetery Hill that evening with but 125 in the ranks. Many of these men are going to make their way into the Lutheran Seminary, where these hundreds of patients are gathered by about 5 p.m., including the commander of this regiment, Lieutenant Colonel George McFarland, shot through both legs. As one of his men carries him into the northern end of the seminary building, he describes looking down the main hallway and seeing Confederate forces coming into the southern end of the building, is changing hands that rapidly. As one Confederate soldier says, these halls change from the halls of learning to the scene of bloodshed and carnage. Now, that battle at the barricade will pit Lieutenant Colonel McFarland, pictured here, against Joseph Newton Brown, commanding officer of the 14th South Carolina. It inspired some art even before the more modern Dale Gallen painting. Here we can see kind of an interesting piece of art, which includes a telegraph pole west of Gettysburg, which I don't think existed yet. The cupola is way out of proportion. It looks like it's just kind of hovering a couple feet off the ground there. But nevertheless, an interesting view looking up the ridge at an overlooked piece of the battle. But these 2 regiments combined are going to suffer casualty rates in the 40%, 50 percentile range for Joseph Brown's men, and approximately, as I mentioned, 75% for Lieutenant Colonel McFarland. Both of these men would revisit Gettysburg. McFarland would come back in 1866. He would stand at the spot where he was wounded, he says, with strange emotion. He had a leg amputated in the seminary building July 3rd, 1863, couldn't make his way to the cupola when he returns in 1866. And so a professor, Dr. Charles Hay, carries McFarland up into the cupola, up a ladder. Joseph Brown revisits in 1882, 19 years after the battle. And he says that as he walked along the western side of the campus, where all those trees were once located, he says they were all still missing bark up to about the height of a man. And that attests to the veracity of the tenacity of the fighting that took place there, even almost 2 decades earlier. Now, as the battle winds down on July 1st, it of course will morph into the fighting that takes place for 2 more days. And the seminary grounds will do a total 180. This former Union stronghold, this position that served as a federal rallying point, as a headquarters for General Doubleday, as a place of refuge for about 300 wounded Union soldiers. All of that now is a total 180. Those men are now temporarily behind enemy lines. This is temporarily, these are temporarily prisoners of war. And that line of blue that was once here is now a line of gray, or for the sake of the map, this line of red. Just north of the seminary, Robert E. Lee is going to establish his headquarters at the home of Mary Thompson on the grounds that surround the house. East of the seminary, stretching through Gettysburg and eventually out toward the Hanover Road and Culp's Hill, we have about 1/3 of Lee's army, most of Richard Ewell's corps, stretching in that direction. And then stretching south of the seminary, the men of A.P. Hill's corps, and eventually we can see Longstreet's men, not quite, they're just off the map. They would eventually make their way further to the south, and we have these two large lines, this Union fish hook southeast of Gettysburg, and this Confederate larger fish hook with fewer men, if you will, or kind of a large upside down L stretching through the town. And just to the south of it, the Lutheran Seminary is the pivot point. It's the headquarters. It's the place where the Confederate nerve center is going to be for the duration of the battle. As we can see in this Gallen painting, these hundreds of wounded Union soldiers are being tended to, in some cases not being tended to because there are no medical instruments. There's relatively little food and water. It's been stripped of the seminary hospital, taken to primarily Confederate hospitals. We can see also here in the bottom right-hand corner, Robert E. Lee, James Longstreet, and Walter Taylor with the headquarters flag of the Army of Northern Virginia, indicating, as we do have in a handful of primary sources, that Lee and his staff are in the general vicinity of the seminary as the days wind by. During the building's tenure in Confederate hands, we have a couple of interesting anecdotes. The first here, this is Jeremiah Hoffman. He's a soldier in the 142nd Pennsylvania, wounded July 1st. This is a view looking southeast from the cupola in 1878, 15 years after the battle. The earliest single view we have from the cupola, relatively similar probably to what it looked like during the battle. The Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill, both of which are ringed, especially Cemetery Hill, with Union artillery. And Jeremiah Hoffman goes to one of the Confederate guards the night of July 1st, and he says, "I can see that our men are a mile away with artillery pointed toward your guns here. Can we do something to indicate that their wounded soldiers are inside of this building so that they don't intentionally fire upon it?" And he's given permission to do that, but there is no hospital flag to be found. Traditional yellow flag with a green H at the center of it. So instead, what they're going to find, these men from the 142nd Pennsylvania, is the largest bright piece of cloth they can conjure. And that is a petticoat belonging to Mary Ziegler, who is the matron, the caretaker of the seminary. It's a large red petticoat. They take off a section of it and they hang it over the banister of the cupola so that Union artillerists can see their wounded men back here inside of the seminary building. It doesn't do a whole lot of good though, because there are also just a few hundred yards south of this building, not even a few hundred yards, a few yards south of this building, Confederate cannon like we see here with the Samuel Schmucker House in the background, the home of the seminary's founder and first president. John Purifoy, pictured here, is a Confederate artillerist from Alabama. He's one of the gunners who was going to be positioned at the 18 cannon that occupied this position. 21 Union cannon on the seminary grounds July 1st, 18 Confederate cannon on July 2nd and 3rd. It's probably the highest concentration of artillery on any small section of the Gettysburg battlefield anywhere to be found. Purifoy mentioned receiving Union artillery fire. Several wounded Union soldiers inside of the seminary building talk about the fact that at one point the building seemed as though it was burning because it's being hit so many times by these artillery shells that are aimed at the Confederate cannon, but ultimately are overshooting their targets. And in the midst of smoke and confusion of battle, they're going to hit these large structures, especially that main building of the seminary. Purifoy also talks about how difficult it is to man cannon in the midst of a scene that was just a day earlier a battlefield. July 1st, of course, there are these thousands of casualties, 15,000 combined. It's the perhaps 12th bloodiest day of the entire Civil War. And he says that the mental fortitude that we had to have in order to continue firing these cannon when we're surrounded by these wounded and dead soldiers. And he takes to one man in particular, who he calls the breathing dead man. It's a Union soldier sitting against a tree. And as he walks up to this man to give him some water, he can't exactly see anything wrong with him physically. But as he looks between the man's eyes, he notices that a bullet has lodged itself in the middle of his forehead. But the man is still breathing. It's unresponsive. Purifoy goes back and he visits him as he's in the midst of manning these Confederate cannon. And eventually, just before the Confederate retreat, July 4th, he sees that the man has succumbed to his wound. So when we consider what this scene looked like, even though the fighting only took place there July 1st, it's still a scene of carnage and chaos in the days that followed. And then after the Confederate retreat, of course, July 2nd and 3rd don't go well for Lee's army, and they're going to pull out of Gettysburg, using the seminary grounds as a base of operation for their withdrawal. This will result in the seminary hospital returning to Union hands. It'll be a United States Army General Hospital from July 1st until September 16th, 1863. Ultimately, 700 patients are treated there. We know the names of about 500 of these men 90% of them are Union soldiers, about 10% are Confederates. And if we look at the famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, S.G. Elliott map of the burials at Gettysburg, we can see the dozens of burials that took place on the seminary grounds and in its general confines. We can also utilize this map to see the Union barricade of July 1st, as well as what is labeled as rebel breastworks. You see the word rebel here. These are built during the Confederate retreat, July 4th and 5th, in case there would be a Union counterattack. So Lee's forces could protect themselves, but that never comes to fruition. Now, as I wind down here for the last few minutes, if we look at the aftermath and some of the legacies of the battle that took place at Seminary Ridge, there are a couple of key areas that we can really touch on. One of them is the fact that on the seminary grounds and in their general vicinity, there are several famous photographs and other images that are created. On July 1st, 1863, Alfred Wadd of Harper's Weekly sketches the fighting that is taking place as the fighting is taking place just west of Seminary Ridge. There's no fighting here, but we can sort of see some men in the distance with rifles. We can see some broken fence rails. We can see what it looked like the day of battle, if his timestamp is accurate, on July 1st, 1863. We can see from a similar vantage point this perhaps most famous photograph of the seminaries, perhaps the first photo of the seminary as well, by Matthew Brady, taken sometime around July 15th, of the man sitting on the fence looking up toward the seminary building. If we blow this up in high resolution on Library of Congress website, loc.gov, you can see not only the broken fence rails, but also some broken windows. We can see some hospital stewards back here, as this is still an ongoing functional military hospital at this point in time. We have some other photographs that are taken not of the building itself, but from a distance or in the general vicinity. I mentioned those rebel breastworks. Right about here is where that famous photograph of the 3 Confederate prisoners is taken about 2 weeks or so after the battle. And further to the west, we have this famous Matthew Brady photograph taken on the farm of Edward McPherson, looking at the northeast corner of Herbst Woods or Reynolds Woods. Back across this field towards Seminary Ridge, we can see the number of trees that are there. And that's the cupola peeking up just above that tree line, about half a mile to the west. So several really famous images of national significance, some evidence to suggest that even Abraham Lincoln was familiar with a couple of these images, which segues to the fact that Lincoln, when he visits Gettysburg, November 18th and 19th, 1863, according to William Seward, Secretary of State in the administration, he says that Lincoln and he had visited what he referred to as the ground around the seminary on the morning of November 19th, 1863. We don't know much about this visit. We do know that at least 2 others, William Tisdale of the 11th New York Cavalry, who operated as a guard for Lincoln, as well as William McDougall, who was a Canadian Secretary of State. Each of them talked about visiting the battlefield with Lincoln. Again, their details vary. Some said that it was by horseback, others said that it was by buckboard or wagon. But according to Secretary Seward's recollection, on the speaker's platform on November 19th, 1863, a reporter overhears him as saying, "I visited the ground around the seminary." It's been suggested by more modern historians that perhaps Lincoln visited this section in particular because it was noteworthy due to the photos that had been already released from this general area, but also perhaps because he had offered command of the army to John Reynolds just a month before Reynolds was killed. And this was the general vicinity where Reynolds had died. And that was a common caption on many of these photographs, is that this was the ground where Reynolds fell. It's off by a few hundred yards, but generally that would have been the understanding for folks that fall of 1863. We can also see some evidence of Civil War memory at the Lutheran Seminary. Today, we drive on National Park Service avenues. One of them is Seminary Ridge or Seminary Ridge Avenue, which is kind of the northern extension of West Confederate Avenue. Here we're standing on that stretch of road with the Charles Krauth House, which still stands. The seminary building will be just to your right from this vantage point. This is the first section that is ever created of what we now know as Gettysburg National Military Park Avenues. It all began here when the War Department established this lane in 1895. And we have this wonderful photograph of these workers as they're laying this road using the Telford system, utilizing a series of stone, basically multiple layers, and ultimately has a steamroller that goes over top of it. But how we visit the Gettysburg battlefield, in many ways, it begins here at the Lutheran Seminary. And also in 1913, we have this group image from the 50th anniversary Peace Jubilee of several dozen individuals. This is a large panoramic image that's cut off on each side. They're standing in front of the seminary. This would be that main staircase in the background. You can see a window there, the Boy Scouts on the ground. But there are also family members and veterans of family members inside of this image. And all these folks resided at the seminary building when it was used as a hotel during the course of that anniversary, including family members of Lafayette McLaws and George Pickett, but also James Longstreet and Ulysses S. Grant and George Gordon Meade. All of them, several dozen of them, had family members who resided at the seminary amid this peace jubilee 50 years after the battle in Gettysburg. Only a couple of monuments appear on the campus itself. One of them for Greenleaf T. Stevens' 5th Maine Battery, a small stone marker on the northern end of the campus. And then also we have that peace portico, that semicircular porch dedicated in 1914 to the peace that had been achieved in the 5 decades since the Civil War between North and South. But by and large, not a place where you'll see too many monuments, though there are today a lot more wayside markers dotting the landscape as you go around the Seminary Ridge walking trail. Finally, of course, we have famous moments. Maybe the main reason why many audiences know the seminary today is its use in the film Gettysburg in 1993. There were 2 seminaries. One was the real building, which does appear from time to time. Real cupola appears from time to time, but there's also a set. Actually, I have these reversed. They should be under their respective images. This is the fake cupola with a Matthew Brady photograph colorized in the background to create the illusion of 1863 Gettysburg. And this sits on top of this facade. They built the western side of the building. That's what you're seeing in most of the battle sequences when the fighting is taking place in the background. But there are some moments where we can actually see the real cupola or the real building situated in the midst of the film. Of course, the building still is there today. It looks largely like it did in 1863, with a couple of exceptions. You can visit Seminary Ridge Museum and learn many of these stories and additional details to them, participate in the cupola tours, participate in some of our other programming. And I'll leave this up here. We do have membership available both yearly, monthly, if you're so inclined. Our next big event coming up is going to be our 2nd annual 24 Hours on the Ridge, but we're open for 24 hours on November 2nd and 3rd in support of the Adams County Community Foundation's Giving Spree. Museum admission is free. We are asking for donations, though, in the midst of the fundraiser. But in addition to the museum being open, we're going to have speakers, tours, trivia, movies, you name it. We have something happening every hour over the course of 24 hours. There is information on that over on your right side there as well. But thank you all very much. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Questions? All right.
So Jerome's from North Jersey. Whereabouts, you know?
He was lived in the town of Orange, Essex County, so kind of just west of Newark. But yeah, he born in Alabama. His father appears to have died the same year Jerome was born, 1839. So we never knew his father. He was a minister in Talladega, Alabama, where the NASCAR racetrack is today. His mother dies at some unknown date not long after. But in the 1850 census, so at the age of 12, Jerome appears in Orange, Essex County, New Jersey. We're not sure if it's an orphanage or a boarding house. It's him and about half a dozen other children. And then a man and a woman, and then there's another 40-year-old woman, and like everyone has different last names. So it appears that it's either an orphanage or a boarding house. We don't know a whole lot about him between then and 1861 when he enlists, but he'll serve his 3-year enlistment. He moves away after Gettysburg from of course, Buford dies in December of typhoid fever, and Jerome transfers out of the cavalry wing of the Signal Corps into the Navy component of the Signal Corps. He's at the Battle of Mobile Bay. And he leaves the Army in 1864 after his enlistment is up, re-enlists then in 1867, and he's in the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, and then dies in 1881 at the Occidental Hotel in San Francisco under unknown circumstances. So he's a figure who is tragic in many ways. In addition to the fact that even after he dies, during the San Francisco earthquake, I believe of 1909, if I'm not mistaken, his grave and thousands of others are either washed away or cremated in the midst of this large earthquake. His remains are never found, and he's memorialized at a memorial park in San Francisco, or just on the outskirts of San Francisco today. So a figure who is so instrumental in terms of our understanding, or at least what we think we know about what Buford does and what Reynolds does. Without Jerome, we wouldn't have record of a lot of the observations that are made from the seminary cupola. It's quite possible we wouldn't know that the seminary cupola was used at all. Buford doesn't talk about it. Reynolds' aides don't talk about it very much because they weren't there quite yet. And so he's a classic example of a figure who, without his contributions, we wouldn't know about the contributions of so many others. But in an ironic sense, by bringing to light so many of the stories that he did, it comes at his own expense. He doesn't promote himself, he promotes others, and he's relatively forgotten in the grand scheme of things.
Samuel Smucker was supposed to be a staunch abolitionist and just a supporter of the Underground Railroad. And he supposedly hid fugitive slaves in his house and his farm. Do you have any more information on his Underground Railroad activities?
In many ways, Schmucker is similar to the trajectory of Lincoln and his views on slavery and abolition. Schmucker starts as someone who is morally opposed to slavery, as Lincoln did, but supports colonization as Lincoln did for quite some time. Add to that the fact that Schmucker is outwardly preaching from the pulpit against slavery, but he's married 3 times, and his second wife is a slave owner. And when they are married, they receive as a gift enslaved people from her family. And he will ultimately, the compromise he basically makes, maybe with himself, is he is going to indenture them. We're not sure exactly the length of time, whether they were even with him when he came to Gettysburg. But he does ultimately, in the 1830s and 40s, start to have a bit more of a transition. Certainly by the time of the Civil War, Schmucker is writing sermons and textbooks in which he calls, in one case, for universal abolition. But in that exact same sentence, he says universal abolition, but if colonization is deemed necessary, then that's a suitable alternative as well. So he's a man he's conflicted. Now, exactly his role in the Underground Railroad, we don't have a definitive answer on. Most of what we know about Schmucker's purported involvement comes to us from 20th century historian Abdul and then his son Frederick Wentz. The library on the campus of United Lutheran Seminary is named for Abdul Ross Wentz, and they wrote a few seminal histories, especially Abdul, on the seminary in 1926 and then again in the 1960s. And it's in those that he talks about how Schmucker housed fugitives at his home, had freedom seekers as you mentioned, at a farm or at a barn. There's nothing, it seems, in the primary source record that we can point to that being definitive. It comes largely in the 20th century. We can't exactly find where the sources are for that. And of course, in the 1920s, when a lot of that is being recorded, the same standard of footnotes that we have today and citations didn't quite exist. And so there's some question there. But it does perhaps fit with pieces of the story. We know that Schmucker, in the midst of the Gettysburg campaign, received word from a former student of his in Maryland that his name appears on a list of people the Confederate Army will arrest if they come across him. Schmucker flees. We think he goes out somewhere toward Easton, passes through York, and he passes through Lancaster and appears to go out to his son's house in Easton. And when he returns about a week after the battle, he finds that in addition to battle damage, his home has been ravaged intentionally by Confederate soldiers. Furniture is destroyed, books are destroyed. There's a Bible that is picked up out of the street and a message written in it by a Confederate soldier who mentions that he has picked it up and puts it back on the shelf. So Schmucker's targeted, and maybe that is due to the fact that he does have these staunch anti-slavery, borderline abolitionist views at that point in time, but perhaps also there are rumors even then of his involvement in the Underground Railroad.
The Eternal Light and connection with Reynolds. I remember being young, I don't know, 8th grade maybe, before I remember seeing that, but I didn't know the connection of it.
Sure. So no direct personal connection, but they're in close proximity relatively to one another. If you're standing at Reynolds' death marker or his statue along Chambersburg Pike, you can see the Peace Light Memorial a little less than a mile to the north of you. Yeah, no direct personal connection, but yeah, they're in the same general vicinity, both there on the first day's battlefield.
Back to General Reynolds. Has it ever been decided whether he was killed by friendly fire or a sniper yet?
It hasn't. It probably never will be. Scott Hartwig, of course, longtime supervisory historian at Gettysburg National Military Park. He wrote a 3-part series. You can find it easily online. And he used the title "Who Shot JR?" Of course, the Dallas reference there for who shot John Reynolds. And it's 3 parts, and he goes through all of the possibilities based upon primary sources, and there are dozens of pronouncements, all the way from Confederate soldiers saying that they shot Reynolds from the McPherson barn to the suggestion of it being friendly fire and everything in between. So it's one of those things where it's probably just a stray volley, but we'll never definitively know. Yeah.
We had Scott Hartwig, I'm sorry, I just wanted to, we had Scott Hartwig speak on that topic,
Okay.
and it went on and on and on, back and forth,
Yeah.
and it was never resolved, even in that meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Conundrum.
Now it is one of many.
About the, I guess I had always thought that Pennsylvania College and Gettysburg were the same. It's just that they were in Gettysburg. Pretty much.
Yeah, so it starts as Pennsylvania College, and then 1921, I believe, is when it changes names to Gettysburg College. So roughly its first 90 years, it is Pennsylvania College, and it changes names.
I don't see any questions on mine, so there are no further questions. Then thank you again for speaking tonight.
Thank you.
And
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me. Yeah, my pleasure.
thanks everybody for coming, and we hope to see you next month in November. Obviously.
Did this go all the way around?
Yes, it started.
I hope to see you on the walking tour. I'll be giving the Civil War walking tour in November.
Great. All right, wonderful.